Aujourd'hui, je vais parler de one of those subjects that I never ever hear talked about in the West, which is of course that the real greatest drug dealing organization to have ever existed in the history of the world is actually the British. Yep, I said it. Hey, Zempak here. So I've been waiting to make this clip for a while, right? And it seemed kind of rude if I was going to make it too close to the passing of the old queen, okay? I mean, hey, that old British queen seems harmless enough, and to be honest, she really had personally nothing to do with what I'm talking about today. But then again, do heads of state carry on the legacy of their forebears in terms of, legacy? I'd argue if anyone should carry that burden, it would actually be those heads of states. So I never really liked the old girl, partly for this reason I'm ranting about today, okay? And that point is simple. In this day and age, everybody knows that drug cartels are the worst kind of people, right? They live on the suffering of others, and they threaten the stability and security of their own countries and cause cascading effects in the geopolitical regions that they're in, whether it's powerful gangs in Latin America or practically narco states in the Middle East that live on drug money alone, right? We shudder at the thought of how far our fellow men have fallen. And yet, none of those states or state-like entities can compare to the actual kings of drug dealing, who somehow in the past few hundred years has done a face turn the WWE can only dream about, and that is the British, okay? British Empire, the British monarchy, and to some lesser extent, actually just the British themselves. So today I'm gonna just spread the word a little bit, a tiny bit, one person at a time. And if you somehow didn't know about it before, and now you will know about it. I am not the powerful, just the voice of one person, and the British were actually the biggest drug dealers in the world and possibly of all time. Okay, subscribe, like, and all that social media nonsense if you enjoy content like this. Honestly, I don't care one lick because I'm already happy with myself. And internet validation, it comes and goes, right? So point number one, what am I referring to, right? Aren't the Brits a bunch of reserved, polite, lovely chaps with royal weddings and funerals these days? Sure, I guess they can be that, but also the kind of drug cartel that started wars with foreign nations that didn't want their drugs. And that's what happened in the middle of the 19th century. In the form of 2 opium wars, right? Just in case you weren't sure that they were willing to force narcotics down other people's throats. They went to war over it not once, but twice, okay? They forcibly sold drugs to a nation, in this case China, right? That explicitly made the substance illegal and unwanted. And you know what? The first time they beat the Chinese, they got Hong Kong. The second time, they forced China to legalize, the whole opium trade, right? Think about that for a moment, right? No matter how terrible the drug gangs of Mexico and Colombia sounds, when we hear them or hear about them in the news, right? What their military tier weapons and brazen daylight assaults, on the government, it's still, those instances are kept entirely in their home countries, right? To understand the depravity of the British, now let me draw some analogies for my fellow Americans, right? Imagine that the worst gangs that we hear about, being exaggerated about on Fox News, but multiply that by 100-fold, right? Imagine if MS-13 actually sent nuclear submarines up the eastern seaboard and started bombarding New York and Philadelphia, okay? All for the right to sell more drugs to more Americans, okay? And if they actually won this conflict, which like the British did in the 19th century, they then asked for a state or two in return to be ruled by them. Let's just call it Florida, right? We know it's not the best state, but certainly it would be missed by some people, okay? Now, if that scenario happened, I don't think any American would think that's justice. And yet, because in history, I guess because British won the Opium Wars, right? I know there are people still alive today that'll say things like, oh, but Hong Kong was so much nicer when ruled by the Brits, and so on and so forth. Yeah, no, Hong Kong should have never been with the Brits to begin with, okay? They were a concession to a drug-dealing group of, I'm sorry to say this, but straight-up criminals, right? I know I can call the Brits of that era criminals because, you know, when they weren't trying to sell like opium to the Chinese, you know, what were they doing? I'm pretty sure they were robbing India or something. Okay, and by the way, you can't say that, you know, that was a different era because they knew the drugs were bad because they didn't sell opium to their own countrymen. Okay, so point number 2. Let's talk about who's actually to blame, right? I mean, is it the monarchy's fault alone, or were the British people involved? To be honest, this analysis can get a little bit dicey, right? Because I really wanted to learn a little bit about the progression to democracy and how that overlapped with the Opium Wars, right? I wanted to be able to say, hey, it's just the stupid kings of the British, the English kings or whatever, who were responsible. Alas, representational government were already well in place by the mid-1800s, right? Sure, not all dudes who could vote back in those days, but the British Parliament already existed and they were already represented by at least the upper middle class. Yeah. Now, I am obviously not saying every upper middle class Brit of that era was a drug dealer, but if I know humanity, and I do know plenty of the type of same decent, polite people, you know, what they care about is British prestige and influence, right? Even if they weren't drug dealers themselves, they certainly didn't complain about the economic clout their global drug empire brought for themselves, right? In the same ways that I can't blame, you know, the British military, right? They were just following orders, right? Fighting to preserve British global power. Who can blame soldiers for defending the ideals of their country, even if it's to push drugs onto other people of lesser technological means? Oh wait, don't we blame the German military for sticking with the Nazis in World War II? And yet we don't have nearly the same revulsions for an entire cast of British troops that literally acted as the largest group of drug cartel enforcement wing on the planet. Why is that again? Someone please explain that to me, right? I mean, they were a multifaceted, not just drug dealing, but remember, they were also robbing and stealing from other parts of the world, okay? So this is just a straight up criminal empire, okay? But masking as a respectable state. That's history. Okay, so finally, how would I personally like this to be addressed exactly? After all, I know people will just say, hey, that was like 200 years ago. The times were different, right? And what's done is done. Stop crying about it. I'm actually not crying about it, right? Generally agree with that train of thought, right? I believe that people who win write histories, right? So all I can do now is raise awareness. What I hate more than anything else is hypocrisy, right? I'm fine with the British getting rich off the corpses of others because they did it because they could, okay? Just don't be coy about it and then never mention it. I mean, can you imagine the children of a drug lord like Pablo Escobar would come out of the woodworks today, start doing philanthropy and saying, hey, I just want to help people and I deserve respect because I am a person of society and I didn't sell any drugs to anybody? We'd laugh this kid, whether it's a dude or a lady, out of the room, wouldn't we? And yet most of the West still seem to have a soft spot for the British royals. What? Where did their money come from? Okay, they have billions and billions of dollars. Look at the backlash that is in America against people like the Sackler family who pushed OxyContin in the beginning of the opioid crisis, right? The British royals make the Sacklers look like a bunch of plebeian upstarts, okay? So maybe no one can go confiscate from the Brits, you know, their stolen wealth from, you know, all those crimes from 200 years ago. But don't make me laugh and think that they are respectable, polite society, all right? Any piece of shit criminal can learn how to use some multiple sets of forks for hunting with fancy hounds or whatever. That shouldn't change the fact that all that money is blood money and can never ever hide the stain on their conscience, not now, not in 1,000 years, okay? So yeah. I don't need anything to be done to the Brits for the transgressions. As a culture, history will be the judge. Those who think that might is right, because might, that's totally fine, but realize that might changes hands over long periods of time, okay? And as individuals, well, aren't the British technically a Christian nation? So I guess the judgment of God will be punishment enough for those people responsible, right? I'm happy just to see the slow withering decline of the British Empire and the British state while its people hangs on to the fantasy of their polite society, right? So long as the rest of the world knows of its fundamental lies. Okay. Cheers. I'll approach it.